Okay, we're live. Welcome back to the Hill of Roses, where we come once again to celebrate the best contributors to our independent policy movement for progress to bring power to the people. With us today, we have Dani Brzozowski with us, who is a candidate in Illinois' 16th District. Dani, welcome so much to the program.
Hello. Do you think it's going to be a problem that we're wearing the same shirt?
Oh, I don't know. I think it's a little different. Plaid is in right now. It's a nice, cool day, luckily, finally in New Jersey, so I won't be sweating today. So I figured I'd bust out a little flannel here.
I like
But
it.
I'm so glad to have you on today to be able to speak through your campaign, get to know you a little bit better, and frankly, hopefully, the audience here will want to support you as well and get involved and be able to donate. So Dani, before we get into all the serious stuff of what we're really trying to change in this country, I'd love for folks out there to be able to get to know you a little bit better. Could you let the people out there know what you are doing for work or you were doing before the campaign, before you decided to run, and why you decided you wanted to hop into the race and run for Congress?
This is the welcome to the life story section of this podcast.
Got to start there.
Yeah. So my dad was in the Army when I was a kid. He was in the service for 25 years. He's a Gulf War veteran. And so 25 years, I'm 35. So he was in the service for most of my life. And I grew up on Army bases all over the world. We moved to the middle of this big district, Northern Illinois. So we're just west of Chicago suburbs. This is a big district. All are parts of 14 counties. And I'm sure we'll get into sort of the makeup of the district later. But we moved right to the middle of the district, to LaSalle County, a small town of 10,000 people right here in the middle of LaSalle County. And for me, the thing that was so powerful about the experience of growing up on Army bases was always a really strong sense of community. It was the idea that we could rely on our neighbors, and that in fact, sometimes we had to. And the sort of feeling of solidarity, right? The idea that we're all in this together, that's so strong in a military environment. And I assumed my entire childhood was in fact unique to military environments. I thought that was, it's born out of the high stakes of soldiers going to war, right? Our tragedies are, by anybody's standards, tragic, and our victories the same. And so when we moved to this town of 10,000, I was really surprised. There was a lot of culture shock there. But one of the things that was so surprising to me was the realization that sense of community that I had long assumed was unique to the military actually existed in lots of other places too. And it existed in a place like this. And from the time I was really young, so I was 13 when we came here. And from the time I was 13, I just realized that was something that held a great deal of personal meaning and value to me. And so I dedicated my entire career to it, to preserving and protecting, to building up communities. I worked in nonprofits for a long time. Mostly in education and literacy. I lived in Chicago for about a decade, served on a bunch of civic and philanthropic boards. I came home in 2015 to that same town of 10,000, where ultimately my entire family had settled. And I opened a small business that served as a sort of community center here in my hometown. And I decided to run for Congress because though the experience of growing up in a military environment gave me a lot, that strong sense of community, certainly my call to public service is informed by this, my dad's service and the sacrifices I saw my mom make alongside him. We didn't have a lot. And I'm sure you're familiar with statistics and have heard stories about military families who subsist on food stamps.
Yep.
That was us. We were poor. I lived in a trailer in Texas, and when we first moved to Illinois, we had a rental property. My mom and dad didn't buy their first house until I was fully grown and out. We lived in this rental property, but couldn't afford to heat it. And so we all five slept together in the living room all winter long. And, after a career spent really trying to help people, I realized that the struggles my family faced, number one, they're not unique. And number two, for far too many people, the challenges that my mom and dad faced as they just tried to do right by us kids, that stuff is getting harder, not easier. And we've got a representative here in Illinois 16 whom it really seems like is beholden to, special interests, conservative donors, big pharma and fossil fuel companies, and has little, maybe no interest in the people of this district.
Yeah, so I have to ask, I think community for a lot of people is kind of a broad term. We're all told we're part of a community right now. And I think a lot of us don't exactly feel like we are attached to those communities in a large part. There's been certainly a lot of isolation that has come from current events, but this has not been just a recent thing with the coronavirus. This has been something that technology has really rooted us away. We've been focused on this outside world. In your opinion, what are some of those defining features of community that you held dear that inspired you to get your whole life centered around community?
Yeah, so it's reliance on one another, right? It's compassion for your neighbors. And I use I guess I use the word neighbors much more loosely than I use the word community, because I don't just mean the people who live on your road. I mean the people around you, right? And that can be in a geographic sense and in sort of a slightly more hippie sense, right? Like the people who are around you, your people. That's your community, right? And those feelings of knowing that you have people to turn to. And I really think that over the course of the past several months, talking about the coronavirus specifically, and I'm hopeful that we talk a little bit about racism and police brutality and the racial justice movement right now, Black Lives Matter, because what I've seen over the course of the past several months is communities coming together in these extraordinarily powerful ways. People who, maybe have never been called to action before, recognizing that there is a moment upon us for so many of us to stand up and say who we are and what we believe in, and that we're willing to fight for those things. That to me is one of the intrinsic powers of community, and something that is just incredible.
Yeah, and I have to ask, it's certainly clear how we've had to band together in these moments of crisis. What are some of those things that you've been trying to do in your own campaign? There's been this separation factor that the coronavirus has, but then there's this, having to come together factor that the protest has had. How has your campaign tried to strike a balance of keeping people safe from this virus while making sure you've come together as a community? What do you think is that right balance for people? Should they be showing up to these protests and making sure that they're part of this bigger movement and just keeping, baseline precautions like mask wearing and, wearing gloves and such? Or do you think they should be trying to protect their own health? Like, how have you struck that tone in your campaign and just as an individual?
Yeah, I saw a really interesting tweet this morning that kind of stuck with me. I'm such an analogy person. And I saw a good one this morning that asked that very question. And the response was, if the bus driver says, stay on the bus, you stay on the bus, right? We all stay on the bus. And then if the bus driver starts shooting the people on the bus, you just get off the bus.
Yeah. Okay.
And I don't want to suggest that, that we're in a moment where we should just disregard coronavirus entirely. I've been to protests. I have been to gatherings that frankly have been more than 50 people. And the organizers in all cases are being really, really aware of social distancing and how important that remains. Everybody is wearing a mask. I don't go anywhere without mine. That stuff is important. But the fact is that, the coronavirus pandemic, the urgency of that crisis has been usurped by the urgency of Black men being killed in our streets by the police. And George Floyd's murder, I think, for so many of us was a moment of recognition that, we have some really urgent, critical needs that we need to address. And that, frankly, it means that we have to compromise a little bit. And I'm not thrilled about it. I've got a family, and certainly, I have been very isolated. We've been running this campaign. I am coming at you from my basement. We've been running this campaign in isolation. It's not easy. The balance is messy, frankly, and we are figuring it out as we go. Our campaign at the start. So one of the things that I think was kind of the prevailing sentiment at the beginning of the coronavirus pandemic, as we all realized the failures of the Trump administration and the incredible danger that we were in, I think so many of us were feeling fear, and we were looking sort of desperately for leadership. And in places like Illinois 16, there wasn't much of it. We're very lucky to have Governor Pritzker, who demonstrated just extraordinary leadership over the course of the past several months. But from our congressional representative, we got nothing. We got hashtag China hid the virus and the occasional joke. It was racism and xenophobia and blame game and nothing that made people feel any better. And so our campaign committed really early to filling in that gap, to addressing those people who were sort of longing for competent, compassionate leadership. So we switched a whole bunch of our phone banking efforts, went to connecting. We put together this huge document. It's a big district, and so there are a lot of resources throughout the district. Put together this huge document that we trained all of our volunteers so that they could make calls, particularly to seniors in the district, and connect them to the critical services that they might need. Things like mental health providers and food banks, and and stuff like that. And we transitioned that work for several weeks. That's what our campaign was doing. We put a halt. We weren't doing call time. We weren't really fundraising. Certainly events had stopped. And that felt very much like the right thing to do. It felt like the only thing to do. And, we've gotten back on the horse here, and we're doing more regular sort of voter ID stuff that campaigns are accustomed to doing during these summer organizing months. But, we have been really, really lucky. So number one, I'm extraordinarily lucky to have this incredible team of people around me who are smart and competent and really resilient. And when it became apparent that we needed to pivot, they did it instantly without complaint or, concern whatsoever. They just did it. And we've also been really lucky to have this grassroots movement of volunteers who are so committed to this race. They're just doing so much work. The volume of work is staggering. There was a day, I think it's been, what is time anymore? Time is a construct.
Yeah, right.
Maybe 2 weeks ago that our team in a single day broke 1,000 voter ID calls, which is incredible, right? We're in a district where we need 150,000 plus one to win. And at this rate, we're just going to call them all. We're going to talk to every single one of them. And it's really powerful. It's powerful to have that kind of support. And when I think about that, and sort of my worldview, which is so community oriented, that's my community, right? Those are the people who are driven by the mission of what this campaign is set out to do. And it's really powerful and really humbling.
Yeah, and I want to touch on this kind of theme because I feel like this is going to be a common point throughout a community. You've mentioned some of the things that you've done specifically in this COVID era to try to bring support and services when the federal level hasn't been sticking up. And I think a lot of people around the country in general kind of feel disconnected from that community factor when it comes to our representation on a federal level. What do you think is, frankly, the role of someone who is representing someone on the federal level to foster community? And what does that specifically look like in terms of needed connection in your district?
Yeah, I love this question. It's hard to think about the answer to this question without talking about my opponent and sort of his egregious errors when it comes to fostering that sense of community. His reputation is for absenteeism. He's never in the district. And so when I think about, my role as a representative of the people of this district, it's impossible to do that job effectively without talking to the people of this district, right? We have to be in communication. I talk all the time about transparency and accountability. And I think those things are really important. I regularly give out my cell phone number to people, anybody who asks for it, frankly. I am really big on ensuring that, when we do town halls, and we're doing them all digitally now, and we're doing lots of them, when we're doing those events, I will answer every single question. And if that means that we're talking for a really long time, then we'll just talk for a really long time, because I feel like it's important that everybody's voice is heard. That kind of approach, I know gets a little bit tricky for people, and it gets particularly tricky if you're a person like Adam Kinzinger, who is really reluctant to answer questions in an open forum, who's unprepared to do that. I'm totally willing. Number one, I'm absolutely willing to do it because I think that's the job. Number two, I'm willing to be wrong, right? I'm willing to say, I don't know the answer to that question, but educate me, help me learn. And number three, I think that voters really respond to that authenticity. We talk about authenticity and sincerity a lot, and I try to avoid the words earnest and naive because I think, those things get conflated sometimes. And I don't want to be over earnest, but I am in this race. What we talked about at the top, the reasons I'm in this race are the right reasons. I care so deeply about the people here, and I really do want to make the world a better place. And I think we have a path to do exactly that. And it takes building up this community of supporters, right? It takes bringing people together. And I know I don't want to do that politician thing where I disregard your question. So I'll tell you some of the very specific things that we do to build community, even amongst our team. We do fireside chats with our interns. So we've got this incredible team of almost 24 interns. And these are mostly college students who are off school for the summer, who feel, for whatever reason, and they have lots of reasons, lots of different reasons, deeply connected to this campaign. They feel empowered by it, or they feel, enfranchised. And we do these fireside chats, and what we're doing is trying to connect them with subject matter experts and people who are involved in politics in some way. We want to make sure that, everybody who's on this team really feels like they're part of the team, because from my perspective, they absolutely are. They are the team, right? That is the campaign. The campaign is the people who are doing the work. And I love that stuff. I do as much work as I can to make sure that I'm personally getting direct voter contact. And that means that I make voter calls my own self. And, that work is not always easy. I had a call today where, man, I was really trying to convince this woman on Medicare for All, and she was not having it. And you know what? That's okay. We ended the call with me doing the thing that I always do in those situations, which is, recognize that we've had a civil exchange. Neither of us is going to move, and that's okay. We have a values difference, and being able to identify what that values difference is. And in this case, I think it's the responsibility of the government to provide for the greater good, to provide basic services, and to focus on our most vulnerable communities in an effort to do that. And this woman thinks that it is the responsibility of the government to provide opportunities for people. Those are two very, very different things, right? That's a values difference. And, this woman is in her 50s or 60s. Unlikely that I'm going to change her values.
Yeah.
Equally unlikely that she's going to change mine, right? I have decided to run for Congress on these values. I'm pretty committed to them.
Yeah.
And so, I think those types of efforts where we're having direct conversations are really, really important to bringing people together, even in a moment like this one. It's what you and I are doing right now. We're having a conversation that it feels like you're here in the room with me.
Yeah. Honestly, there's a couple of those leadership traits that I really think are important. The first is, frankly, I think it's very disingenuous when any politician kind of says they know everything or is not willing to answer because they don't want to look bad because they don't know it. Frankly, just admitting to the fact that we're not all subject matters in everything and we want to be constant learners is a really important trait. And I think it is, frankly, admirable to admit when you don't know something and you are willing to learn more. The second is, no movement, no campaign is ever about one individual. It's almost always rooted in the team. And so empowering the other individuals to take some level of initiative in driving the campaign forward is a really important step, because it's supposed to be representative of a whole movement. And the best way you have representation is giving opportunity to actually be part of it and lead the change. And then, the third part there, just the willingness to agree to disagree. I find a lot of the times, it's easier to have that when you're you have that human connection. It's over the phone. It's face to face. I think so often when we see this progressive divide, when you see online, it's almost this it's my way or the highway. It's a moralistic position. It's I can understand where you're coming from with a different value set. I just happen to have my own differing opinion. And so I wanted to hear a little bit more about that value set and, some of the top things that you want to champion in your campaign. You started to allude to Medicare for All as being one of your top priorities. But what would you say are your top 3 to maybe top 5 solutions that you want to prioritize if you are to win this race and get into office?
Yeah, so there are 2 that I talk about constantly, relentlessly. One is Medicare for All. And amongst my team, and you can probably imagine that the vibe is very collegial and, very much like this. So my team sort of has an ongoing joke about my solution to so many things being Medicare for All. And it's because, providing healthcare to people really does make a really big difference in their lives. So we are unabashedly Medicare for All and have been for this entire campaign. I think what's really interesting about running on a progressive platform in a district like this is conventional wisdom suggests that the only path to victory in, a district that's a little bit rural, I like to make a joke, people look at it, take an aerial view and there's cornfields and people get freaked out. It's like, I don't know what to do about that. I don't know how to talk to those people. But you talk to these people the same way you talk to anybody who's struggling and suffering. You find out what their problems are, and then you propose practical solutions for addressing them. And I think one of the things that is so compelling about the way we're running this race is that I'm a progressive. I look like a progressive and I talk like a progressive, and nothing about me suggests that I am a moderate, because I'm not. And it would be disingenuous for me to pretend that I were a moderate. And number one, voters respond to that sincerity, right? They know when you're faking. And number two, I think voters in this district are so excited that we're proposing these bold strategies to address their problems, because it feels like they're actually going to work, because they are. It just happens that progressive values and the sort of, all of the checkboxes, Green New Deal, all of that stuff, as you're thinking about what is progressivism right now, it just so happens that all of those things are exactly the right things to help lift up the people of this district. So Medicare for all, for sure. I think, talking about the Green New Deal, intertwining our economic and environmental policies is so important. This is a district that's home to every kind of energy. We've got it all. And we have sort of the foundational infrastructure to just start building, to, creating just so many clean energy jobs, to building a sustainable infrastructure. I think this district could be, a real trailblazer in how we handle the creation of clean energy jobs, in how we handle addressing the climate crisis in rural America. We have the capacity to do that here with the right leadership and the right investment of resources. And we know what that looks like, right? We have a sense of how to do that work. The other thing that I talk about without stopping is campaign finance reform. And, campaign finance reform is not an emotional activator for me, right? When I am getting really worked up about something, lately, of course, it's racism and police brutality. Historically, it's been a woman's right to choose. It's been, immigration is one that's sort of an emotional activator for me. Campaign finance reform, I don't think there are many people who are out here like shedding tears over.
I don't know. We love it. That's our heart.
I mean, listen, money in politics has corrupted the integrity of our democracy, right? And it's the money in politics that, has so many tertiary effects. Everything is affected by money in politics, right? So you think about Adam Kinzinger's vote against capping prescription drug costs. And this is such a bipartisan issue, right? Everybody knows that prescription drug costs are too high. Something like 90% of Americans agree that prescription drug costs are too high. And yet we've got a whole bunch of Congress people who are still voting against capping prescription drug costs. And so common sense is kind of like, well, why would you do that?
Yeah.
Well, listen, the reason is because they're taking money from big pharma. They're not beholden to us as constituents. They're beholden to their donor base, right? They're beholden to all of these big pharma execs. They're beholden to the donor class. And so, I think about things like that, or something like ballot access, right? So I talk a lot about representation and how incredibly important it is, I think, for, people of color and women and queer folks and people who come from disadvantaged backgrounds like mine to be represented in Congress. Seems obvious, right? How are people going to collectively make decisions if, the scope of their perspective is so extraordinarily narrow? But the reason we can't do that is because it's really expensive to run for Congress. And lots of people just can't afford it. They can't afford to take time off work. They can't afford, they can't afford to make campaign donations to themselves. They can't afford to give themselves a loan, as so many people do, so many candidates do. And so that issue, the goal of representation with money in politics becomes, well, not impossible, right? It becomes incredibly difficult at the very least.
So I just wanted to dive into those to just get a little bit of a clarification. I wanted to start with the campaign finance and the democracy reform ballot access. What are some of the solutions you think need to be done for things like that? Like campaign finance, a large common progressive value is to be able to overturn Citizens United. But to be able to do something like that, it takes, a supermajority to achieve. You need the states to be able to do it. You need a constitutional overruling of what the courts had done. How do you think we can be changing our campaign financing system without necessarily tackling that head on? Because that's not going to be something that's easy to do in one term. That's like a long-term building up, and we may need to get creative of doing another tactic. How do you think we tackle campaign financing?
Well, listen, I think the For the People Act was a great start, right? That addressed a number of these sort of, and not just campaign finance reform, but sort of democracy, the integrity of our
There's a lot of
democracy.
it in there.
But I love the idea of publicly financed campaigns. I think it puts power back in the hands of the people. And I can't think of anything off the top of my head that puts power back in the hands of the people that I would be against, right? That is my entire mission, right? That's what we're trying to accomplish here, is ensuring that it's the people of this district and the people of the United States of America who have the power, who have the say. That's what democracy should be. And unfortunately, that's not what it is right now. And we are in a district here in Illinois 16 where we've got a whole bunch of really savvy voters who recognize that, who understand that, the political system, who feel like the political system works against them, not for them, and understand that they're right. They know that the system was in fact designed in that very way, and that it continues to exist in that same way, in much the same way. I think certainly overturning Citizens United is a goal, but there are lots of ways that we can get around, the existence of Citizens United, and sort of restore democracy.
Yeah, no, I think that makes sense. And I think the value you said there of just the empowerment of people, that's like the core value of what we're trying to champion here. And I think it does make sense. The people who should have the power in this country are just the common people of America. Too often it feels like, frankly, that the politicians are picking their voters more often than we get to pick our politicians. And so I totally agree with you there. The second clarification I wanted from the top three priorities that you were starting to lay out, in terms of Medicare for all, I wanted to hear your perspective of why you think we should be having a single payer system compared to something like a public option. And I'm not talking about necessarily like the buy-in public options that are going to still be basically the same Medicare plan that we have existingly and just offer to everyone. But like, why would we not want to just have the no duplicative coverage ban removed from Medicare for all? Why do you think it's very important to have single payer be the answer?
Yeah, so, it's an interesting question, and an interesting phrasing of the question. Here's the truth. When we have conversations with voters, and this isn't, not just in this district, but when anybody is having a conversation with anybody else in the United States of America, people generally agree that the goal is universal coverage, right? Mm-hmm. We think that that's the end game, right? Everybody should have access to healthcare. It's like a basic value that, though we can disagree on nuances to solutions, we're all pretty much in agreement that there's a problem, and the problem is not enough people have coverage.
Yeah.
We know Medicare works, right? We know Medicare is a system that we can run efficiently and effectively and to the great satisfaction of most people who receive their benefits via Medicare. Now, that said, we've made some marketing missteps with Medicare for all, right? We talk about Medicare for all, and what we really mean is taking the parts of Medicare that work really well and taking the parts of Medicaid that work really well and expanding benefits to everyone until it's universal, right? Until everybody has their healthcare via this one program that we call Medicare for all, that looks like all the best parts of the government-funded system that is privately executed in so many cases, in a really effective way. I don't think, frankly, that there's much room for arguing about it. The system that we have right now, from a values perspective, is a for-profit healthcare system that treats patients like consumers. That cannot work. A for-profit healthcare system is never going to have the best interests of patients top of mind. That's never going to be the primary goal. It can't, because the primary goal is in the name and it's profit, right? And so we know that can't work. But from a more pragmatic, less than a philosophical perspective, the astronomical increase in costs that we anticipate under the current mixed system is totally untenable. People often say, well, Medicare for all is too expensive. No, what we're doing right now is too expensive. We're talking about trillions of dollars over the course of the next 10 years. We can't afford that. We need a solution. We know what that solution looks like, and it's what we call Medicare for all.
Okay. And the one reason I focus on that is because I frankly agree with you. The goal is universal health care. Full stop. No one should have cost be a barrier to them. And it shouldn't be like an ACA subsidization that's leaving, they consider 3%, like Biden has proposed, an acceptable margin of error. I don't. It should be 100%. Yep. But the reason I ask for, specifically about that duplicative coverage ban is that is the goal to eliminate the private insurance, or is the goal to get as much people covered as quickly as possible? Because I see a lot of people who have existing plans who are going to end up spending more in total potentially from Medicare, because, you know, Medicare is very well administered, but the Medicare for All system that is being proposed is a different program. It has more services, it has more cost sharing compared to the existing program. And so what prevents that from being a suitable option? I see a lot of people very hesitant to leave any form of just private. It doesn't have to be for profit. Like, there's a lot of countries abroad that have, you know, a mix of a public system combined with like a nonprofit system in the private space. Why do you think we need to have all of our health coverage managed under one, you know, single entity? And then you can have supplemental above that, obviously, but why should the baseline of care all be provided by the government, in your opinion?
Yeah, so it's less, my interest is less in dismantling the for-profit insurance industry, right? Yeah. That I don't care. Let it continue. They can do whatever they want over there. My interest is in providing healthcare for the people, right? And that is, you know, I mentioned earlier that I think it's the role of the government to provide for the basic needs of the people in the interest of the greater good, putting the interests of the most vulnerable communities in this country first. And this is one of those needs, right? It's healthcare. And so, expanding the system does exactly that. I also think, you know, over the course of the past couple of months, as the coronavirus pandemic has left so many millions of people unemployed, we have seen more clearly than ever before the incredible danger of having employment and healthcare tied together. You know, it was never meant to be permanent, right? It's a fluke. It's a flaw in the system that we just didn't address fast enough, you know, before it snowballed into the disaster that it is now. And what we have now is millions of people who are both unemployed and now uninsured. And that's a problem. And as long as we continue to allow employers to sort of hold healthcare, you know, over people's heads, we're further empowering employers. And again, I'm not interested in empowering employers. I'm interested in empowering people.
Yeah, no, I think that makes sense. And I would love to at another time keep diving into that, because I can go all day. But I think it's important to kind of turn to the next point, which is you have a very clear-cut agenda. But I think there's been a lot of cynicism that's come from, you know, progressives, independents alike, about the ability to cause change within the system, even when we get some of our own in. And we have like a progressive caucus now. I think it's 91 in total members. But we don't feel like we're getting any strong representation in Congress. If you were to be able to get into Congress, you're able to win your race, what do you think is some of your strategies to start executing some of these things? Obviously, it would be helpful if we had democracy reform, but it takes some form of strategies to even get that democracy reform. What would be your leadership approach if you were to be elected?
So I think it looks very much the same as the campaign, right? It is, you know, I mean, remember, John, that it's people, right? When we're talking about bills that need to be passed, the way bills get passed is people vote on them. People vote on them, right? And so it's relationship building, it's coalition building, and frankly, it's ensuring that we have a critical mass, not just of Democrats, not just of progressives, but of people like me who are vocal and noisy and hell-bent on the kind of change that we know is necessary for the people of this country.
Okay, and so I'm curious, if you were to give advice to the existing progressive caucus, what do you think they as a coalition need to be doing to get more of a seat at the table? Is it just focusing on getting more membership in these down ballot races to get more people into the caucus? Is it having some conflicting feelings with the leadership of the Democratic Party, like the Tea Party of the past? What do you think is that strategy for them to get more of a seat at the table?
So I think it's both of those things. I think that, you know, remember that this movement is still relatively new, right? Yeah. And we are growing. This is, let's call it infancy or maybe early toddlerhood. And what it requires is cultivation and investment. It requires some coddling, some parenting, if you will, right? It requires that, you know, progressives in positions of power and authority in this country look at races like mine in districts that seemed like long shots 6 months ago and that seem markedly less so now for a whole variety of reasons. And it's helping, right? So that we have people like me, so that we have more progressives in office. And then once we're there, once we have that critical mass of people, it's really pushing that agenda in a focused and practical way. And it's saying, I'm not big on litmus tests. That's just not my thing. Choice, for sure. You've got to be pro-choice. That's my only litmus test, really, I guess. But beyond that, it's identifying what are our deal breakers? What are the things that we're not willing to compromise on? And then working backwards, right? How are we going to make this happen? Who do we need on our side? And what are the compelling arguments? I have some experience doing this, and I always say coalition building is my superpower. And that comes from working in nonprofits for a long time and being a person who, to be super honest, which you've gathered is my style, I am often in a position where I'm pushing for something that's a little bit at odds with what everybody else is pushing for. And that requires kind of corralling all of these fringe interest groups, right? It requires getting all of these people who, maybe identify the same problem and have different ideas about how we solve it, and getting everybody on the same page about what that solution actually looks like and how we implement it.
So I have to ask, you said you're not a big fan of, litmus tests, but, there has to be some level of standards for you to build a coalition to, define progressivism in some value. And obviously you said the one litmus test is pro-choice, but, a lot of Democrats, I think, would say that's the standard position. How do you know who should be the allies to get into the fold and you would want to support? Like, for example, if you were to offer endorsements, if elected, how do you try to think about what those criteria are?
Yeah, so I love this question, John. It's a great one. So I'm not interested in being the person who determines who is and is not a progressive. I don't care. You know what? Call yourself whatever you want. If we're fighting for the same things, then we're allies. We're on the same side, regardless of what the rest of your agenda looks like. If you want to show up and fight alongside me in getting a bill passed so we have more pathways to citizenship, welcome. Please come on in. We've got work to do, right? And the same is true for literally anything else that I'm trying to accomplish in Congress. I'm far less interested in serving as a career politician and creating whatever, being in a leadership role in some caucus that may or may not have any intrinsic value. And that's not to suggest that the caucuses don't have any intrinsic value. It's to suggest that my interests are in fighting for solutions to the problems of the people of this district.
That makes a lot of sense to me. The one last question I have before I look to some of the audience questions that I have. One of the big policy areas that we care about, our whole movement here is centered around democracy reform as a major pillar of empowerment of the people to be able to unlock so many other policies. And the other is economic power. And you started to mention some of the services and having a sustainable environment. But I'm curious, how do you feel about the ideas of universal basic income and giving direct support to people compared to a service like Medicare for all?
Yeah, so I get asked this question all the time. And I will tell you the way I feel about UBI is that I'm not yet convinced. And when we were talking earlier about saying, I don't know, I don't know about UBI, but I'm also not totally fixed against it. I believe that UBI puts people in positions of power, in positions of slightly greater power, and doesn't do much for the people at the bottom. What we have on our campaign, and I will say with the exception, certainly during this pandemic, extraordinary times call for extraordinary measures, and everybody should be getting a bigger check than they are getting, right? We need more help. Everybody needs more help. And so, this is sort of an anomalous, this time exists kind of outside my typical approach. On our campaign, we have, I think, really critically about some of the creative strategies that we might employ to address what UBI tries to address, and I think falls a little bit short. One of the things that I like to talk about is a program that we call Stopgap Loans, which is, you're probably familiar with the payday lending industry, extraordinarily predatory, really bad. And so what we do, what this policy that we have on our campaign does is it dismantles the payday loan industry. Essentially, it disappears. It's no longer legal to do that kind of business. And we replace it with a government-funded program that is very low interest rate, flexible repayment term loans. No questions asked. You come in, you need help. we're going to help you, right? This and this, I see you nodding because it makes sense, right? It makes sense with my values. It makes sense with the values of this campaign. And those values are, how do we provide for the greatest good while keeping in mind that the greatest good requires that we provide for the people who are most vulnerable. And I think programs like this help to mitigate some of the potential damage, right? Some of the sort of price gouging and the collateral. Think about landlords, right? So everybody gets an additional $1,000 a month and suddenly rent prices get jacked up, right? I think the Stopgap Loan program helps to mitigate some of those challenges while still providing what I believe is a really, really necessary service to people who are in really dire straits and who have been taken advantage of by an economy that really is designed to take advantage of them.
Okay, so just to clarify of some of those pitfalls, you kind of mentioned a little bit that alluding to the rent example. What would you say are some of those other examples of where you think it falls short?
Well, I mean, it's price gouging of any sort, right? And we see it happening. This is the United States of America remains a relatively capitalist economy. And some of the downsides of that include capitalism, right? And so this is, it is the organic consequence, I guess, of, money coming in and then where that money has to go out.
Okay, so in my opinion, frankly, there's other legislation that you could have for price controls. We were talking about beforehand about having price controls for drugs. What is to stop necessarily having something like rent control to fix those barriers where you're saying there's an inflationary impact of something like a universal basic income in these key sectors? What, in your opinion, makes that not a feasible path forward for universal basic income?
Yeah, it may very well be. This is one of those places where I'm not yet convinced, but that doesn't mean it's impossible to convince me. I'm just not there yet.
Fair enough. And we'll be able to talk much further in the future because that is a key area we love to fight for here on the channel. I'm going to turn my attention to some of the questions that I got from the audience right now. So far, the first question I got, this is more of a fun question. What are some of the books that you're currently reading? Speaking of learning and constantly wanting to be a learner as a campaigner, what are some of the areas you're trying to draw information from?
So I am reading 2 books right now, which is actually rather unusual for me. I'm not one of those people who reads multiple books at the same time. I'm reading The End of Policing, and I am also reading this great book called Braiding Sweetgrass, and I have been reading it for a little while. It's a book by an Indigenous woman who talks about sort of ecosystems and connecting with the land in a way that is narrative and really beautiful. And it's a sort of very peaceful, beautiful book. The End of Policing, I just started, and I'm sort of corralling a small book club of friends because it's the kind of thing that I feel like I'm gonna get the most out of if I can also have some discussion, some intense, presumably discussion as I'm reading.
Yeah, that certainly makes sense to me. I do think there have been some subjects that have been elevated to the higher end of the list to be able to inform ourselves. I think one of the things that I am curious about is, expanding this beyond books. How do you try to get your news sources as an individual to get that type of information as well? I think there's such a polarization of news. You have the divide of independent media, mainstream media, but how do you try to be an information gatherer?
Yeah, I mean, I really rely on the people around me. So from the perspective of a candidate, my staff is extraordinary at this. I really do rely on them. My team is, again, super smart and competent. They know what they're doing. And I ask a lot of questions, probably a really obnoxious amount of questions. So today, for example, I was asking for a memo on this piece of legislation that the Democrats are proposing related to police reform. And, as I'm sort of looking at the bulleted list of things that are in that bill, I am digging in. What does this word mean? Tell me about this phrase and why this is the word that was chosen and how it differs from, this other thing, right? If we're talking about, public safety, what's the difference? What are they getting at? Public safety versus, police department, right? Like let's community policing initiative. I want to know, like, what are those nuances and why we're choosing this particular phrase versus something else. I am a person, and I don't know, frankly, I don't know how other candidates are when it comes to getting real in the weeds, but I love the weeds. I like to hang out there a lot. And, insofar as I am able to become as informed as possible, that's my goal. I don't start out as a subject matter expert in anything. Certainly there are things that I think a lot about. Foreign policy is such a great example of this. We began this campaign. Foreign policy doesn't come up that much in this district. It's something that I think is a real mistake because we have an opponent who is dangerously hawkish, and to whom people in the district tend to defer because he also has military experience. And like I said, I'm an Army brat. I absolutely understand the value of military service. I respect it. I think it's super important. That's great. Doesn't necessarily make you a foreign policy expert. But people in the district, voters in the district, tend to look at Adam Kinzinger and think, well, he's in the military, so he's the guy. He's on the Foreign Affairs Committee. That's great. From my perspective, we need to be democratizing that conversation. We need to be admitting that this stuff is really hairy, like Israel. God, that's complicated, right? It's like very scary to talk about Israel for so many people because it's super complex and it feels like a lot to get your head around. But when I set out on my journey to become educated about Israel, for example, again, I was super open and honest about what I didn't know, where the limitations of my knowledge were, and asked a lot of questions so that I could get to a place where I felt like I was informed and able to come to, my own opinion based on my values and based on my understanding of the situation. I think that stuff is really, really important. And it all goes to that same thing of, being really transparent and making sure that we're sort of doing the work.
Yeah, that makes sense. So let's do two more questions before we wrap up. This next question that I got from a Hardy Hat, they asked, what are your views on legalizing weed for recreational use and thoughts on industrial hemp? And I would also like to expand upon this question to just ask what your position is on all drugs and their decriminalization.
Yeah, so I'm for sure for decriminalizing at the federal level cannabis, and industrial hemp, super important. Important here in the district where we have a number of hemp farmers, and there is a small organization of business owners, hemp business owners. Super important, all for it. I think probably many of your viewers and listeners are on side with this issue, and so probably we don't need to dig into it too deeply. When it comes to other drugs, I'm where I am on UBI, which is I'm ready to be convinced. Somebody compel me. I think we certainly have. This is a district where the opioid crisis has been just devastating, and I have done some work in this sphere, working with local activists and nonprofit groups. And this is a place where we could talk a lot about coalition building because it really requires that. It's also a place where I would say, Medicare for all is part of the solution. But, recognizing that drugs, sort of writ large drugs, right, can have this, outsized impact on individuals and communities, I think is really important and needs to be treated with a great deal of gravity.
So just to clarify that last point about the rest of the drugs, in your opinion, you're not there yet on decriminalization. Do you think that they should be going to jail for consuming and possessing these drugs? Like, what does that look like? Because in my mind, that's what happens without the decriminalization. Yeah.
So maybe it's the decriminalization is the tricky word here, right? So I am, this sort of ties into criminal justice reform, right? Punitive justice doesn't work. And I am not for a justice system, an injustice system, as we often say, right? That, that has incarcerated so very many people for so few serious offenses. I think when it comes to violent crime, we need to, think really seriously about what the consequences look like. And when it comes to everything else, we need to think really seriously about what our value system looks like as a country and how we have implemented it in our criminal justice system.
Okay. So the final question that I had for you is, this has been a Republican district for a while. Adam Kinzinger is a Republican that you're going to be running in the general election against. So what, in your opinion, has been ways you've been trying to be able to appeal to some of those Republican traditional red voters to be able to come over to your side?
Yeah, so it's a great question. If you had asked me at the very start of this campaign, or maybe a little bit before, what portion of our strategy was going to be focused on turnout and what was going to be focused on persuasion, I would have said, we got to leave real heavy on the turnout, because I don't know how many people I'm going to be able to persuade there in the middle. And that was sort of said a little bit tongue in cheek at the time. And now, because the truth is that we need to persuade some of Kinzinger's voters. Some people who have voted for Adam Kinzinger have to vote for me for us to win. And those conversations have been way easier and way more productive than I might have imagined they could be. When the lines were drawn for this district a decade ago, it seemed pretty safely Republican. And in 10 years, a lot has changed for all of us, right? A lot has changed for me personally, and a lot has changed, I'm sure, for you personally, and a lot has changed in politics. A lot has changed in this country. We're living in a different world than we were a decade ago. And Adam Kinzinger's appeal 10 years ago is gone now. Adam Kinzinger has a poor voting record that, pits him against almost everybody in this district. He's voted against farmers. He's voted against, he voted against the Equality Act, skipped the vote on extending the deadline for ratification of the ERA. He's voted against people with pre-existing conditions. He's voted against all of us. And he has done that without showing up to take responsibility for his actions. And that last piece, I think, is so critical for voters who consider themselves Republicans. And maybe less true for sort of pro-Trump Republicans, and more true for members of a Republican Party who feel like that party doesn't exist anymore. When Adam Kinzinger was first elected, there was a Republican Party that could engage in the kind of civil discourse that's a priority for me. And that party has all but disappeared. And it's left a lot of voters feeling ignored and underappreciated. They have nowhere to go. And they recognize that people like my opponent are, they're pro-Trump conservatives, right? Yeah. It's a different faction of the party now. And so it's a couple of things, right? It is appealing to that sentiment, right? Adam Kinzinger's been in office for 10 years. He's done nothing for us, right? What has he done for us lately? Nothing, right, ever. Yeah. That's a message that a lot of people respond to. It's also engaging in civil discourse, which is thematic, right? A lot, and I think it's really important. And it's another thing that we've talked about a lot. It's authenticity. I think at the door or on the phone with a voter who might consider themselves a Republican or an independent who tends to vote for Republican candidates. Number one, even if we disagree on what solutions look like, we're going to agree on what our problems are. Mm-hmm. You cannot say that about Adam Kinzinger because he's not here. He doesn't know the problems in this district. I'll give you an example of a tweet he sent this morning. So we're all in this moment where throughout the district, in every nook and cranny, I was in Mendota, Illinois. This is a tiny town. 3 protesters on a corner there. People are protesting everywhere, right? This is an intense, emotional, fraught moment for the country and for this district. People are talking about defunding the police. Adam Kinzinger this morning sends out a tweet, super jokey. I'm sick of hurricanes. Let's defund hurricanes. Okay. Let me break it down for you, buddy. So number one, let's not make light of Black Lives Matter. Let's not make light of police brutality. Let's not make light of the murder of George Floyd. Let's also maybe not make light of hurricanes, particularly when you may know, Adam Kinzinger, if you were ever in the district, that in the forecast for tomorrow, June 9th, we have tropical rainstorm Cristobal bringing rain and wind to northern Illinois. Now, I'm laughing a little bit because it's outrageous, not because I think it's funny, this is a very real consequence of the climate crisis, right? So Adam Kinzinger has just wholesale disregarded, God, so many people. I mean, everybody in this district, right? And I think the people who are persuadable are recognizing that Adam Kinzinger does not care. He does not care about the constituents of Illinois 16. He will not show up for us. He has not shown up for us. He is complacent. He has seen us as a threat. He's been calling me a socialist for months. So we know that he sees us. We know he's vulnerable. And, his donors have started dumping money into his campaign funds, knowing that we're coming for him this fall. But, for a long time, he has felt safe, and he's not safe anymore. And I think he realizes that. I think the voters realize that. They know that they deserve better. And that's exactly what this campaign is giving them.
Well, Dani, I want to thank you for taking the time with us today. I think it was really revealing just your leadership style in general. So I wanted to thank you for coming on to be able to answer these questions. Even if we don't see eye to eye on every single policy, I think there's leaps and bounds beyond your opponent. And I think that is a progress that we need to make. And there are so many of your campaign values and proposals that I do like. So I hope we can continue this conversation. How can people help your campaign? You're in the general election already, so you got some time until November, but we got to start early. How can some people be able to help you out if they want to join your movement?
Yeah, so our website is DaniForIllinois.com, DANIFOR, Illinois, all spelled out.com. You can find us on Twitter and Facebook, and we launched our Instagram just today. Engaging with us on social media is important, making donations to the campaign and then amplifying that message out there on social media really matters. We are, we're grassroots, and we are building this grassroots movement of people in the district and beyond it to make this happen. And it's really exciting. The more, the merrier.
Well, Dani, thank you so much for letting us know how to get involved. Everyone, you can be able to see that again if you need it repeated to you. We have it scrolling across the bottom of the screen currently, DaniForIllinois.com. Dani, thank you so much for being here again. I really appreciated your time. I hope we can continue these conversations, because some of these positions I'd love to flesh out even more with you, because I think there is an honest disagreement on some of these things that deserves that conversation, just like you're doing with your constituents. I think that's really important, is just listening to everyone, and at the end of the day, trusting your gut and staying true to your values. So thank you so much for being here. Rosebuds, thank you so much for being here to listen to Dani and about her campaign. Please go again to DaniForIllinois.com. And just as we're wrapping up here, I want to let you know some of the stuff that we have on our program this upcoming week. We're going to be interviewing this whole week candidates. So tomorrow we're going to be talking to Chris Armitage. He's in Washington's 5th District. Then we're going to be talking with Noelle Famera. She's in Hawaii's 2nd District. Then we'll be talking on Thursday with Robbie Goldstein. He's in Maryland's 8th District. And then we'll be talking with Lindsey Boylan in New York's 10th District. And finally, we're going to be having our big event on the 14th, this Sunday, where we're talking solely about how we get a government to be representative, efficient, and most importantly, trustworthy. Because we need leaders like that we've had here today to simply give us the frank truth, even if it's not the popular opinion of the whole audience, because there's a lot of people who like UBI. I really think Dani is a really good leader here, and I really appreciate your genuineness, Dani. So thank you again for being here. Thank you all for being here. And I hope you all are staying safe out there in these crazy times right now.